When I write essays, sometimes I draw on information that I find in history books. And sometimes I turn to quotations or facts that I locate in historic documents, such as letters, journals, old advertisements, or photographs. I often find it's important to situate my subject matter within its historical context. So here's an example. I once published a critical essay examining how British readers reacted to an article by the American novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her piece was called "The True Story of Lady Byron's Life." It appeared simultaneously in the September 1869 issues of the Atlantic Monthly here in America and in Macmillan's in England. In the article, Stowe accused Lord Byron of committing incest with his half-sister, Augusta Leigh. She said she did this during his marriage to Lady Byron, who was an acquaintance of Harriet Beecher Stowe's. And even though this bit of scandalous gossip had already been around for more than 60 years, at the time such a blatant and public accusation against one of England's most revered male poets, by an American lady novelist no less, set off a fierce attack in the popular press. This attack was widespread and poisonous. Stowe's friend and fellow writer, Oliver Wendell Holmes, called it the Byron whirlwind. The popular backlash against Stowe included satirical cartoons such as one published in the Merryman's Monthly, a British magazine. This cartoon depicts Stowe wielding an immense quill and conjuring Lord Byron in the shape of a satyr. Byron rises on a dark cloud from a great inkwell. At Stowe's feet, a snake is marked with the word "scandal" on its back. A horned toad sits on copies of two of her novels, Uncle Tom's Cabin and Dread, and in the background, a human skull and a jarred fetus rest on a shelf. The caption reads, "Mrs. H.B.S.'s great incantation. Who have we here, the great poet Byron or the devil?" At one level, this cartoon clearly bashes Stowe and her writing by linking her writing to a kind of witchcraft. But if we look at the wider historical context, we discover many more levels to this satire, as well as to the 19th century prejudices that it contains. So here's that context. Stowe's first best-selling novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was outsold only by the Bible. More than anything else, the novel served as a vehicle for abolitionist rhetoric. It has even been credited with helping to start the Civil War. The novel's incredible success made Southerners and their supporters publicly question Stowe's qualifications to critique the institution of slavery. As a result, after publication, Stowe had to assert her authorial integrity again and again. So, this British cartoon goes back almost 3 decades to target certain qualities that Stowe had always insisted gave her credibility as the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin. These qualities were her identities as a Christian, as a mother, and as a staunch abolitionist. In this cartoon, the assault on Stowe's Christianity is by far the most obvious. It calls her an agent of the devil, an image that's reinforced with the scandalous serpent at her feet. In addition, Stowe's work with pen and ink transforms Lord Byron from a great poet into a satanic incarnation. And this suggests that Stowe's writing is not nearly so great as his. It can only defile and debase the great. In turn, the elements of witchcraft, especially that pickled fetus, hint that Stowe has gone awry as a mother. In the illustrated scene, she's not nurturing and protecting children. Instead, she's polluting the domestic space with her sorcery. And this scene doesn't just depict sorcery as magic, it depicts it as black magic. The stuff of Stowe's art, her ink, drips thick and black. And Stowe's 2 slavery novels, Uncle Tom's Cabin and Dread, represent that art. By implication, then, the cartoon casts aspersion on all of Stowe's writing, suggesting that what she has said about Byron is influenced not only by black magic, but also by a different kind of blackness. This is blackness that's bound up in racist attitudes about slaves. And so this tactic implicates Stowe's abolitionism. Okay, so knowing something about the historical context makes a difference in understanding this cartoon. And this context also includes a few additional things. For one, knowing that there were supporters of the American South living in England. Also that plenty of critics didn't believe that American literature was as good as England's, or that a woman could write anything worth reading. Additionally, that literary men were often hailed as geniuses precisely because they were libertines. And finally, that a popular way to undermine the authority of a Christian was to cast her as a false believer, or in this case, as a witch. And it's this wider historical context that sheds light on why, less than 6 months after the publication of her article, Harriet Beecher Stowe produced a 482-page book that she called Lady Byron Vindicated. This book reasserted her claim that Byron had been guilty of incest, and it included a number of documents as evidence. So why did Stowe feel the need to write such a lengthy book, restating what she'd already said? It's because the vilification that Stowe had experienced in the popular media made her feel insecure about her authority as an author, all over again. And that's even after Abraham Lincoln supposedly hailed her as the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war. So to try and silence her detractors and to make herself feel more secure, Stowe drew on the authority of history that's found in documents. It didn't work. Her critics were too sexist and too British for that. Still, it's significant that Stowe turned to what rhetoricians call non-artistic proofs to try to bolster her integrity. To explain what I mean, let me put Stowe on hold for just a moment. Classical rhetorical theory holds that artistic proofs come from the writer's mind and character. These proofs emerge from 3 rhetorical appeals, including an author's claim to credibility or ethos, her use of reason or logos, and her appeal to an audience's sympathy or pathos. Now, by comparison, non-artistic proofs are forms of persuasive evidence that come from outside of the writer. Non-artistic proofs are drawn from sources that already exist. These might be data from empirical research or quotations from studies or interviews, maybe allusions from literature or information gleaned from those who write about history, as well as from historic manuscripts and documents themselves. For essayists, non-artistic proofs are essential, especially when writing historical essays. They provide a powerful backdrop for any writer who's trying to connect personal memory and experience to the larger project of human history. So, this means that an historical essay draws from the work of scholars who study past events, as well as from texts and images that contain facts about the events themselves. At the same time, historical essays also place the writer's ideas within the moment of their creation. What I mean is this: such an essay looks backwards as well as forwards. People and places that are long gone lie next to the writer who is very much alive, thinking, reflecting, synthesizing, and writing. The past is static and fixed, but the writer is dynamic and fluid. So all historical essays are a kind of conversation between the living and the dead. Now, one simple but powerful way to think about how to write an historical essay is to launch a conversation between the dead and the living, especially within the context of your own life. And one readily available source of personal history is found in the objects that you live with. Discovering the stories within certain objects, who made them, who owned them, and where they came from, is, in my view, part of the pleasure people find in watching TV shows such as American Pickers or Antiques Roadshow. An antique gun or book or painting conjures the past, linking those of us who are very much alive to those who once held, used, and owned the very same things. And so passing down these objects is one of the most significant ways that, as humans, we can contribute our verse to what Walt Whitman called the powerful play of history. Like history, objects are also static and fixed. And so your interaction with them, how you hold, wield, or wear them, is a dialogue between you and the humming and thrumming present, and these otherwise inanimate objects that contain and express the dead. I will go so far as to say that all of your objects tell stories. They relate the stories of how you first came to own them, as well as the stories of how they were originally made. So, one way to start writing historical essays is to look through the rooms in which you live and pay close attention to the objects you find there. As you glance around at spoons and books and guitars and clocks and pillows, ask yourself, which objects intrigue you and why? From where did they come? What is their function? And how has that function changed? Why do you keep these particular thingamajigs? Are they useful to you? Or are they just useless, merely decorative? Most importantly, what do they mean to you? Thanks to the rise of middle-class Victorians and their need to exhibit their newfound wealth and sense of taste, they bought all manner of what Henry David Thoreau has referred to as gewgaws upon the mantelpiece. Today, we are very much Victorians. Most of us have grown up in a consumer culture, and we've received lifelong training in what it means to be a savvy shopper. So many of our deepest desires for acceptance, love, beauty, and success are bound up in the things we buy, use, wear, and display. Objects mark us, and they tell our stories. So an object can launch a compelling historical essay because it has the capacity to bring together what it means to you and what the same thing meant to others from the past. The object you might choose to work with doesn't have to be an antique. It really can be anything at all. So to get your wheels turning, here are concrete examples of objects that have inspired historical essays. They all come from a collection of essays that I edited called From Curlers to Chainsaws, Women and Their Machines. All of the essayists in this book use objects as a way to enter history and to tell their own stories, to become a part of that history. And they turn to a surprising range of everyday machines, such as a Maytag washer, a Singer sewing machine, a Sony radio, an artificial leg, a stove, a gun, a curling iron, a tractor, a lawnmower, a Dodge Dart, a chainsaw, a microphone, a camera, a stapler, 2 different typewriters, and a No. 1 pencil. These run-of-the-mill contraptions serve as extensions of these writers' identities. And in almost every case, these writers turn to non-artistic proofs, quoting from primary and secondary historical sources, to make their objects reverberate through time like a struck bell. But how can a writer select which sources to include in a historical essay? My advice, cast your net wide. Read everything you can about your chosen object, including the work of historians, advertisers, and everyday folk who write about their keepsakes in their letters, journals, and blog posts. There's a creative nonfiction writer named Maureen Stanton who is really, really good at writing historical essays. She always brings in an eclectic mix of non-artistic proofs into her pieces. One of my favorite essays of hers is called Laundry. It starts with a very simple action, a woman washing clothes. As this essay unfolds, Stanton includes references to numerous objects that people have used to do laundry over many centuries. She mentions the ancient Egyptians who washed their clothes on rocks. She talks about the British colonists in Massachusetts who boiled water in kettles and used bluing to brighten their garments. And she gives information about an early patented washing machine developed by an Englishman named Roger Rogerson in 1780. Stanton also provides details about the first hand-cranked clothes dryer called a ventilator and the first automatic dryers that came into the American market just after World War II. In addition, Stanton describes how Roman women discovered soap in about 200 AD. She explains, washing clothes in the Tiber River at the foot of Sapo Hill, rubbing the fabric with clay from the riverbank, these Roman women noticed their garments became cleaner in that location. They figured out that ashes and animal fats were responsible. Remains from sacrificial ceremonies atop Sapo Hill, which were washed by rain into the clay bank. Saponification, the chemical process for soap making, is still named after Sapo Hill. Beyond objects such as soap and ventilators, Stanton also considers the places where women do their laundry. Obviously, she writes about how generations of women have used natural water sources such as riverbanks and ponds. But she also talks of her own grandmother's tiny kitchen, where her grandmother put in a fancy new electric washing machine after Stanton's grandfather died. Stanton also writes about her mother's cellar, where her mom did all of the family's washing, ironing, and folding. And she also touches on the numerous laundromats in cities, where Stanton herself ultimately discovered a kind of sanctuary from the hustle and bustle of life. Doing laundry, Stanton writes, is repetitive and mindless, purposeful and perpetual. And watching my clothes tumble around in an endless relay race, socks handing off to shirts or pants, is relaxing, like watching a fish tank. This is an excellent example of how Stanton makes the past resonant within the now. Yet her essay isn't just about the history of doing laundry in the Western world. It's also about a kind of mysticism that's bound up in washing clothes. And even further, it's about an act of love, especially when someone does laundry for someone else. The very heart of this essay is when Stanton grapples with telling the story of her fiancé's terminal illness. She describes what it was like to do his laundry while he was dying. Stanton and her fiancé Steve were together for only a couple of years before he was diagnosed with cancer, a cancer that started in his liver and spread along his spinal column. So all of the domestic chores fell to Stanton: the cooking, the cleaning, the shopping, and the laundry. At first, going to the laundromat was a way to take a break from watching Steve waste away. Going to the laundromat was an excuse, she writes, a legitimate guilt-free reason to escape Steve's and my tiny apartment for a few hours. Washing laundry was simply a chore I could handle, a relief from taking care of Steve, who was dying swiftly for a 30-year-old, though it was also a slow, lingering death. After Steve died and Stanton mustered the energy to wash clothes again, she came across a pair of her fiancé's boxer shorts in a pile of dirty laundry. They were garish, with yellow, red, and blue polka dots, a joke gift from Steve's cousin after he'd entered the hospital. And now, holding them in her hands, the boxer shorts looked tiny. They reminded her of how Steve had shrunk to only 100 pounds, even though he was tall, 6'1". So what did Stanton do with the boxer shorts? She writes, I washed them, and a handkerchief, the last 2 pieces of Steve's laundry, which I still have. In this way, Stanton's historical essay is also an elegy to Steve. Her final paragraph drives the idea home. In the laundromat, she explains, as I conduct the most ignoble of chores, I find myself pondering the cycles of life, the structure of time, the nature of humanity. How we all need clean garments, clean sheets to sleep on. How we are all alike, really, walking around in our clothes, covering our bodies with fabric, as if that could protect us from anything. It's with this conclusion that Stanton brings her essay back to all of the people doing the world's laundry, from Egyptians to British colonists to her grandmother to Stanton herself. Here, the reader finally discovers how personal objects and actions can become part and parcel of human history. Laundry comes to represent the loss of a loved one, and at the same time, it also symbolizes a reclamation of that death. So historical essays can contain both the past and the present, the individual and the universal. But there's another thing I want to say about them as well. Please, don't stuff your own essay into the standard 5-paragraph format that so many historians use. This includes, by the way, the form's longer cousin, which just turns 5 paragraphs into 5 longer sections. Why do I feel the need to beseech you? Because whether you realize it or not, you've been indoctrinated into the 5-paragraph cult, and you might write one without even trying. If you don't believe me, type historical essays into a Google search, and you'll see that almost all of the hits will offer you advice on writing a 5-part piece. For instance, the Rutgers School of Arts and Sciences website explains that the basic elements of any historical essay include a thesis and evidence divided into 3 parts, an introduction, the systematic development of an argument, and a conclusion. But don't be fooled. Those 3 parts are actually 5, because in systematically developing that argument, their recommendation is to touch on 3 main points. So what exactly is the 5-paragraph essay? In case you've wiped it from your memory banks, let me remind you. The 5-paragraph essay is taught relentlessly in high schools and colleges as the single container in which to shove any kind of essay, regardless of its subject matter or purpose. It's quite popular among English and history teachers because it revolves around that infamous thesis statement. Remember the thesis statement? That's where you're supposed to distill your entire argument into 1 or 2 sentences. Before landing on a thesis, however, teachers urge you to start with an opening paragraph that grabs the reader's attention. Attention-grabbing options include an anecdote, an extended example, or a string of quotations. Then, after the thesis is trotted out, the writer is supposed to provide 3 extended examples to prove this claim. These examples become paragraphs 2, 3, and 4. They are the body of the paper, the place where all of those non-artistic proofs come in, either attesting to a writer's research on this topic or exposing a lack thereof. Finally, the writer is supposed to give a concluding paragraph, which starts by stating the thesis. It ends with yet another attention-grabbing anecdote, example, or quotation. And then, bada boom, bada bing. There's your historical essay. Now, there are good reasons why the 5-paragraph format is everywhere and why teachers have hardwired their students to write them. It's easy to remember, and more importantly, it is effective in certain rhetorical contexts, namely when taking a timed essay exam. But the 5-paragraph essay is an assault on a writer's creativity. That's right. An assault. It's the death of creative thinking. You want to write historical essays that attract and affect your readers. You want to make them see the intersections between the past and the present, between the universal and the particular, in eye-popping and mind-blowing ways. So I repeat, avoid the 5-paragraph form as you would an outbreak of E. coli. Now, in the writing classes that I teach, I refuse to let my students write 5-paragraph essays. Whenever I hear the words 5-paragraph essay, I want to turn my head and spit. Those who worship this structure believe that any topic and any approach to that topic can be contained within the exact same form, which is a bit like using a ketchup bottle for all of your condiments. Yes, a ketchup bottle is a wonder of technology, especially now that the industry has moved from producing those glass bottles with screw tops to those revolutionary plastic squeeze top ones. It's also true that some other sauces might do well in a ketchup bottle, like mustard or mayo or marinara. But what about peanut butter? When you consider putting peanut butter, especially the super chunky kind, or chutney or salsa, or even salt, into a ketchup bottle, all of a sudden, the technology is no longer a wonder, but a disaster. The classical rhetorical elements of historical essays, including persuasion, organization, evidence, and the adoption of a captivating and convincing style should not have to be contained within a 5-paragraph format. Instead, form should follow function. Maureen Stanton doesn't choose the ketchup bottle. She doesn't go for a default structure just because she's making a historical argument about the nature and purpose of laundry. Instead, she toggles between offering insights into the diverse history of how humans have done their laundry for more than 36 centuries, and then other sections that tell laundry's story through her grandmother, her mother, and her own moments of washing clothes, towels, and bed linens. Now, another essayist who eschews the ketchup bottle is my colleague, Jeffrey Hammond, a prolific writer of creative nonfiction. One of his essays, called My Father's Hats, spends a good deal of time giving readers a rundown on the history of hats, from Paleolithic caps stitched together from animal skins and Greco-Roman helmets to Renaissance crowns, Victorian top hats, and the more modern fedoras. Hammond's point in providing a mini history lesson on the hat's development is to make clear that these articles of clothing aren't arbitrary. Hats make the man by advertising his class status, religion, and place of origin. Once a hat becomes personally iconic, Hammond explains, it's yours for good. To offer evidence, he cites historical examples, such as Napoleon's bicorn, Sherlock Holmes's deerstalker, and Roy Rogers' famous Stetson. Yet Hammond's essay isn't just a rundown of men's hats through the ages. It's primarily about his ideas on what hats symbolize. Hammond writes, "When I was little, my father's life could be read in his hats, and I couldn't wait to get my own grown-up hat." Hammond goes on to lament that in our own day, the hatless man is now the norm, unless he decides to wear a ball cap. In middle age, Hammond himself acquiesced to the ball cap, a hat that cuts across class lines. Ball caps have come to be acceptable attire for sporting events, classrooms, and restaurants alike. But Hammond also knows that, eventually, he will put on a golf cap, one that he inherited when his father died. This hat, Hammond admits, now hanging with my baseball caps near the front door, seems destined for future use. The day will come when baseball caps will start looking silly on me, like a man who is trying too hard. As a child, I waited patiently for my grown-up hat. Now I realize that this hat is waiting for me. In this historical essay about inheritance, Hammond offers the personal stories about his father's and his own hats as bookends on either side of the middle of his essay. And it's the middle where he defines different kinds of hats across history based on their function as either work hats or play hats. Indeed, it's here that he provides a fascinating look at the development of the hat across the centuries. In other words, Hammond and his hats, like Maureen Stanton and her laundry, fashions a form for the essay that fits the sum and substance of his own thoughts and arguments. Hammond wants that deep dive into history in the center of his essay to resonate for when he returns at the end to his father's cap waiting patiently for him to put it on. Hammond's essay is tight and rational, like a well-made box. And so the architecture of the piece feels inevitable and weighty, the result of airtight research and writing. In a sense, Hammond's essay feels good in the hands, like a perfectly tailored hat. In contrast, Stanton is after the feel of a dialogue or a conversation, a back and forth between the whole of humanity cleaning dirty clothes across space and time, and the distinct voices of women from her own family doing the same in a single country over a single century. Stanton's piece is more episodic, and its structure feels organic, the way a conversation among women spins out over cups of coffee or glasses of wine. She wants to catch her reader unawares, to keep us engaged and curious, not knowing exactly where her piece will go next. So, okay, how might you follow the leads of Stanton and Hammond and deprogram yourself from the 5-paragraph essay cult? If you return to that object I asked you to select from your living space, you can start to write an historical essay, not from a thesis, but instead by simply following your own nose. Read whatever you can about this object and type up the notes on what you discover. Jot down any memories you have that are connected to it. And if you can, talk with others who might have memories of this object as well, including family members or friends. Then write it all down, read it through, and think about how you might merge your notes into a single historic essay. Maybe it will be best to write a linear chronology like the way history is usually told. Maybe you want to try, as Stanton did, a back-and-forth conversation between your non-artistic proofs and your own memories. Or maybe it's best to bookend the middle of your essay, as Hammond did. Maybe there's another structure awaiting you, a narrative circle that turns from past to present to past again, and that even imagines the future. Whatever form your historical essay takes, remember this: history is subjective, and the way we tell stories from the past influences how we come to understand it. I hope that this idea of writing about an object of your own is exciting. You have the historian's power to control and shape the lessons a reader will learn from your choice. Those lessons will be of the now and also of the then. They will impact how we understand you and also how we understand ourselves, as well as humanity writ large.